Amaka was scared of going to meet her uncle inside his bedroom. She knew he was up to something uncomfortable again. Let's play the game again. Don't worry. You will not feel uncomfortable this time. We will play the game gently, Mr. Johnson said to Amaka. But Amaka was not ready to play any funny game with her uncle. The game makes her feel sad and uncomfortable. She never wants to repeat what happened between her and her uncle. Uncle, I don't want to play any more games anymore. I don't like the way I feel about the game, Amaka said, feeling scared and nervous. Uncle Johnson became anxious and impatient. He wanted to make Amaka uncomfortable anytime soon. But Amaka was not ready for his tricks. Uncle Johnson began to think at that very point. He began thinking of a better idea. And soon his face changed. His eyes were covered with a bit of anger. He looked at Amaka and said, "This is my house, so you must follow every instruction I give." He shouted at the girl, making her scared at the moment. Amaka was afraid of what Mr. Johnson might do to her if she refused to play the uncomfortable game with him. Something was telling her to run from the house at that moment. But she was just 14 and was new in the city. She had nowhere to run to. And if she decided to run, she might stay hungry in the streets for days. "Uncle, please, I don't like the game," Amaka pleaded one more time. But Mr. Johnson was greedy. He stood and grabbed Amaka from the door, shut the doors, and did the uncomfortable thing to her. She faced another round of uncomfortable silence and treatment from the greedy uncle. There was no one who could stop this from happening. Her uncle's kids were still young, just like her. His wife was a traveler who never stays at home. There was no hope for Amaka as she received the same uncomfortable feeling from her uncle. Mr. Johnson was not bothered about her. He was only concerned about what would make him feel better. While this was going on, Madam Alice, Mr. Johnson's wife, who went out to another state for a business trip, came back home. She usually stays longer for her business trips. But this time around, Madam Alice decided to spend only 3 weeks on the trip she went to Vegas. Because she was missing her husband and her 2 beautiful children. So she returned back to her city and to her house. When Madam Alice entered the beautiful-looking apartment, she was excited and eager to meet her husband and kids. But Madam Alice noticed something when she entered. She noticed that the whole room was silent and empty. She quickly went to check on her children and found them sleeping in their separate room. She knew her husband was supposed to be at home because it was Saturday, which meant no work for him to do at the office. She walked gently to her bedroom and tried opening the door. But it was locked. Madam Alice tried opening the door to her matrimonial bedroom again, but she realized that her husband had locked the door from the inside. She wondered what could possibly have made her husband lock himself up inside the room at that time of day. At that time, Mr. Johnson realized that his wife was at the door. He became scared of what to do. He quickly departed from Amaka and told her to remain silent. "Darling, it's me. Open the door, I'm back," his wife shouted again. As Mr. Johnson's wife tried to open the door again, Uncle Johnson quickly rushed to unlock it. He pretended to be surprised to see his wife standing at the door. "Darling, what are you doing here?" Uncle Johnson asked, trying to hide his guilt. "I came back early from my trip because I missed you and the kids," Mrs. Johnson replied, looking around the room suspiciously. "I thought you said you were going to stay for 4 weeks, so why are you back so quickly?" Mr. Johnson asked. He was scared that his wife may find out about Amaka, who was hiding inside the room. "Honey, what are you sounding like you don't like my coming? Or don't you miss me?" Madam Alice asked her husband. But she noticed that her husband was not feeling okay. He was looking left and right. He looked disturbed and confused. "Why not? I'm happy you are back. But you can't come to the room now. As you can see, I am sweating profusely. That is because I have been cleaning the whole house, because it's Saturday." Mr. Johnson lied to his wife. "But darling, are you sure everything is okay? You looked worried," Alice said to her husband while she tried to enter into the bedroom. But her husband held her back. He stopped her from going into the bedroom because Amaka was there. "Darling, you can't go inside now. I'm still cleaning the room. I don't want you to come and mess it up all over again," Mr. Johnson lied. "Honey, I just need to drop my bag," Madam Alice said, trying to enter the room. "Just take your luggage upstairs. I'll soon be done with the cleaning," Mr. Johnson said to his wife. Madam Alice was not comfortable with the new behavior of her husband. She felt like something was definitely wrong. "Maybe my husband is hiding something," she said to herself. Then she took her luggage to the second bedroom located upstairs. Immediately, Mr. Johnson's wife left with the luggage. He quickly decided to use the opportunity to take Amaka out of his room. He went to where Amaka was hiding and dragged her out. He told her to run faster to her room without looking back. "Make sure you don't tell your aunt about the game I played with you, or else I will not take you to the new school I was planning to register you at." "Or don't you want to go to school?" Uncle Johnson asked the young girl. Amaka loved education and would never want to miss an opportunity to return to her education. "I want to go to school again," Amaka replied, but sadly. "Good girl. So don't tell your aunt about this, and I'll take you to school and pay all your school fees," Mr. Johnson convinced. So Amaka left his room. She couldn't even walk normally because she felt so uncomfortable and weak after the game with her uncle. Amaka entered into her room and began crying again. She couldn't believe that at her age, she had been playing uncomfortable games with her uncle. She needed someone to talk to, someone who could help her. But at some point, she was scared that her uncle might decide to take her to her poor mother if she decided not to play the game with him again. After a few minutes, Uncle Johnson dressed himself up like nothing had happened between him and his niece. He walked out of the room and met his wife sitting in the living room. He noticed she was not happy. "Darling, what's the problem? What's wrong?" Uncle Johnson asked his wife. "Because I don't trust you anymore. Tell me what you're hiding from me," Madam Alice asked, feeling insecure and disappointed at her husband. "Darling, everything is fine. I'm not hiding anything from my wife. You have to trust me," said Mr. Johnson. But Madam Johnson was not convinced. She had the feeling that something was not right about her husband. "I will definitely find out about whatever you are hiding," Alice muttered in her heart. Meanwhile, while the husband and wife were arguing, Amaka was standing and hiding in a corner. She was listening to the conversation. Something was telling her to tell her aunt about the game her husband always played with her, while another part of her heart was telling her to keep it as a secret, or she might end up being sent out of this house. As the argument between her uncle and aunt continued, Amaka's heart beat faster. She didn't know what to do or who to turn to. The tension in the house was palpable, and Amaka knew that it was only a matter of time before things came to a head. But for now, she was trapped in a living nightmare, with no escape in sight. Weeks turned into months, and Amaka thought she had finally found some sense of normalcy. Uncle Johnson had been keeping his distance, and she had begun to feel a little safer. But the memories of the game still lingered, and Amaka couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. She felt like she was walking on eggshells, never knowing when Uncle Johnson might strike again. One day, Madam Alice announced that she would be going on another business trip. Amaka's heart sank as she watched her aunt pack her luggage. The thought of being left alone with Uncle Johnson again filled Amaka with dread. She knew that as soon as her aunt was gone, Uncle Johnson would have the perfect opportunity to continue his twisted game. Amaka felt a cold sweat trickle down her spine as she watched Madam Alice zip up her suitcase. She wanted to beg her aunt not to leave, to stay and protect her from Uncle Johnson's clutches. But the words got stuck in her throat, and all she could do was watch in horror as Madam Alice prepared to leave. "Amaka, take care of yourself while I'm away, okay?" Madam Alice said, giving her a warm smile. Amaka nodded, trying to hide her fear. But as she watched her aunt walk out the door, she couldn't shake off the feeling that she was being left to face a nightmare all over again. Madam Alice hugged Amaka tightly before leaving for her trip. "I'll be back soon, dear. Take care of yourself and do well in school. Amaka nodded, trying to hide her fears. Her aunt had already registered her at a new school, and Amaka was grateful for the distraction. But as the days went by, Amaka couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. She knew that Uncle Johnson was waiting for his chance to strike again. So one day, Amaka sat in class, staring at her book. But she couldn't concentrate. All she could think about was what her uncle did to her. Her teacher, Mrs. Okoro, noticed Amaka wasn't paying attention. Amaka, what's wrong? You're not learning anything, Mrs. Okoro said. Amaka shrugged. She didn't know what to say. Mrs. Okoro decided to follow Amaka home to see if everything was okay. When they got to the house, Uncle Johnson answered the door. What's going on? He asked. I'm Amaka's teacher, Mrs. Okoro said. I noticed she's not doing well in class. Is everything okay at home? Uncle Johnson smiled. Everything is fine. Amaka is just being lazy. But Mrs. Okoro didn't believe him. She looked at Amaka, who was standing quietly beside her uncle. Amaka, is everything okay? She asked. Amaka wanted to tell Mrs. Okoro the truth, but Uncle Johnson squeezed her arm. Everything is fine, Ma, Amaka said. Okay, Amaka. But if you ever need to talk, you know you can come to me. Mrs. Okoro looked unsure, but she left anyway. Uncle Johnson turned to Amaka and smiled. You're not doing well in school, Amaka. That means you have more time to play with me. Amaka felt scared. She knew she was in trouble. Uncle Johnson's face was stern as he looked at Amaka. What did you tell your teacher? He asked. Amaka shook her head. I didn't tell her anything, I swear, Uncle. Uncle Johnson's eyes narrowed. Wanted to be sure if he was safe with his dirty secrets. Are you sure? You didn't tell her about everything we have been doing together, you know? But Amaka shook her head again. No, Uncle. I didn't tell her anything. So Uncle Johnson's face was relaxed a little, knowing that the secret was still safe. Good. You must never tell anyone about our little secret. Do you understand? Amaka nodded, feeling scared. Yes, Uncle. Uncle Johnson smiled. Good girl. Now let's keep playing our game, okay? Amaka was not ready to play any more games with her uncle. She was confused, unsure of what to say. Soon Uncle Johnson's phone rang. It was a call from Amaka's mother. She called, trying to check on her daughter. As soon as Uncle Johnson picked up the call, he gave Amaka the cell phone. The phone and speak with your mother, Uncle Johnson said. Amaka's heart sank as Uncle Johnson handed her the phone. Amaka's hands trembled as she took the phone. Mama, she said, trying to sound cheerful. Her mom's voice was warm and concerned. She was very happy to speak with her daughter again. Amaka, how are you? How's school? She asked. Amaka hesitated, unsure of what to say. She didn't want to worry her mom, but she couldn't bring herself to tell the truth either. School is fine, Mama. I'm doing well, she lied. Her mom sounded relieved. She was so happy that her daughter was finally able to go back to school after a long time of dropping out. That's good to hear. And how's Uncle Johnson treating you? She asked. Amaka felt a pang of guilt. She knew she was betraying her mom's trust by lying, but she didn't know what else to do. He's treating me well, Mama, she said, trying to hide her pain and sound convincing. Her mom's voice was warm and appreciative. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you, Uncle Johnson, for taking good care of my daughter. Amaka felt sick to her stomach as she handed the phone back to Uncle Johnson. He smiled and spoke to her mom for a few more minutes before hanging up. As soon as the call ended, Uncle Johnson's demeanor changed. His eyes gleamed with excitement, and he reached out to grab Amaka's arm. Where were we? Yes, our game. Let go and play our game again, Uncle Johnson said, smiling at Amaka. Amaka shook her head, trying to pull away from Uncle Johnson. I don't want to play the game anymore. Why do you always want to play the game with me? Why not with other people? She asked. Uncle Johnson's expression changed, and he smiled. Ah, Amaka, the game is more interesting when you play with young people. You're more flexible, he said, his eyes glinting with mischief. Amaka was young and confused. But why? She asked. Uncle Johnson moved in close. Because the game will make you grow faster, Amaka. You'll become wise beyond your years. Just think about it. You'll be smarter and more mature than all your friends, he whispered. Amaka's eyes widened as she listened to Uncle Johnson's words. She wanted to be smart and wise, and the promise of becoming mature beyond her years was tempting. Despite her initial reservations, Amaka found herself falling for Uncle Johnson's trick again. She nodded slowly, and Uncle Johnson's face lit up with a smile. Good girl, Amaka. Let's play the game and you'll see how much you'll benefit from it, he said, his voice dripping with deceit. Amaka had a feeling of doubt, but Uncle Johnson's words had already taken root in her mind. She nodded again, and Uncle Johnson pulled her close, ready to continue his twisted game. Amaka lay on the bed, her body numb and her mind blank. Uncle Johnson had taken advantage of her again, and she felt like she was getting used to it. But deep down she knew it was wrong. As she stared at the ceiling, her eyes wandered to a book on the shelf. She had seen it before, but never bothered to read it. Something about it caught her attention now. She got out of bed and picked up the book. As she flipped through the pages, her eyes widened in shock. The book talked about how wrong it was to play games with someone who wasn't your husband. Talked about how it could hurt you and make you feel ashamed. Amaka felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She realized that she had been living in a nightmare, and she didn't know how to wake up. But as she read on, she felt a spark of courage ignite within her. She knew she had to tell someone about what was happening. She thought about her teacher, Mrs. Okoro, and how kind she had been to her. Amaka made up her mind. She would tell Mrs. Okoro everything, no matter what happened next. She was ready to face her uncle's anger, even if it meant he would take her back to her mother. As she lay back in bed, Amaka felt a sense of determination wash over her. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to fight for herself. She was ready to take back control of her life. But as she drifted off to sleep, Amaka couldn't shake off the feeling that she was being watched. She knew her uncle was still in the house, waiting for his next opportunity to strike. And Amaka knew that she had to be careful. She had to be brave. Because she was about to take a stand against the one person who had hurt her the most. To be continued.